Hello, Garland Nixon here with Jeremy Kuzmarov. He is the editor at a great magazine called CovertAction magazine. Man, let me tell you, if you want to see some stuff about JFK and CIA and covert evil intelligence things, CovertActionMagazine.com is the place to go. Today, we got big things to talk about. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here with Jeremy Kuzmarov, and we got to do this before we get going, just so you'll see CovertActionMagazine.com. Let me show it to you. This is Jeremy's, and if you want to know stuff about the CIA and all kinds of terrible things they're doing, there we go. MIT's collaboration with Israeli military contractors, you name it, all kinds of stuff going on here. The Munich Olympics, you name it, they got all kinds of stuff. And historically, search through their old stuff. If you want to search something like JFK or RFK or something to do with the CIA, use their search. A lot of good stuff, CovertActionMagazine.com. It was started by former CIA guy, Philip Agee. And I know some people like John Kiriakou and a lot of really smart people who contribute now. CovertActionMagazine.com. Let's get going. Before we start, well, I do want to talk about the dirty war in Syria, which is interesting. They're going to pull the troops out. And Tulsi Gabbard has said, as like so many other people, there's some things I really disagree with her on, but like she's done really good stuff as far as the what's talked about the dirty war in Syria that I think is important. But before we get going, let me just ask you your thoughts on what's happening in Ukraine. Look, the corporate masters have decided at the Ukraine endeavor. It's gone as far as it's going to do, and they're going to hit a light switch on it, in my opinion. I'll just say this, Jeremy. I did a video. People can look on my channel and find it ways back. And I said, let me tell you how the Ukraine conflict is going to end. And I said, they're going to use the Samsonite option. And I had a picture of a Samsonite luggage. And I said, when they're ready to go, they're going to pack their luggage and they're going to walk out of Ukraine so fast, you'll never know they was there. And that's what's happening. Anyway, your thoughts on what's happening with the, shall we say, rapid exit of the Ukraine project, Jeremy?
Well, I think Ukraine cannot sustain the war much longer. They've lost so many young men. And I mean, there were reports I was reading in the New York Times where, youth would be going to a concert and they were afraid that they would be kidnapped. And a huge number of youth had left the country, that they had to extend the draft age, and they're simply running out of the manpower. So practically, this can't go on any longer. And I mean, it's been a disaster. It's been a Vietnam type disaster. And I mean, now I'm starting to hear some recognition, as far as the Ukraine. I mean, what has Ukraine got out of this? They've got the loss of their youth. And, Henry Kissinger once said, be wary of, it's bad to be an enemy of the United States, but it's even worse to be their friend. And now Ukraine have learned the hard way that lesson, that their entire generation of their youth has been destroyed. Their economy has been destroyed and turned over to Wall Street. So, I mean, they've been used as a pawn. And, I don't know, I think all these liberals who had the Ukrainian flags, I don't know what they're going to do. They're just going to take the flag down from their home. And I don't know if they'll ever admit that they were, totally wrong and they supported a Vietnam type intervention. And if they'll ever give credit to, people like us who from day one were saying this was a Vietnam war in the making and a disaster, and we're being lied to as usual. But we were marginalized and shadow banned and attacked as Putin lovers. I don't know if these, often by liberals, I don't know if they will come around and say you were right. But, people have big egos and never like to admit they were wrong.
Yeah, that's a fact. Absolutely. All right, let's go with Syria. And I think it's important. And that is, I've been studying it as you for a long time. And even the first so-called WMD attack in Syria, right? I'm like, oh, that's fraud. It's fraud. That's a fraud. And then the second one, we had the OPCW come in. Some people came in and they found out that it was a fraud, and then they fired them. And the OPCW put new people in and rewrote the. And Aaron Matei did a lot of work, but those of us who followed it from the beginning, well, before it happened, we knew it was going to be a false flag, right? We knew this was CIA. We knew about Timber Sycamore. Do me a favor before we get started. One of the things that people talk about is Christopher, what's his name, in Libya, right? The Christopher Stevens and the embassy attack. For those who don't know what that embassy attack was about, could you kind of let what you know about the reality? Remember, they're like, well, it was over a bunch of mad, angry Muslim people over a video or something that was shown and all that crap. Talk about what the original, what was the town called?
Benghazi.
Benghazi, yes. What was up with the actual Benghazi attack?
Well, yeah, they presented Christopher Stevens was the U.S. ambassador to Libya, an ally of Hillary Clinton. And, he was ambushed and killed with 4 other members, I believe, of the U.S. Embassy staff. But they presented him in the media, this kind of Boy Scout. But, I mean, he was actually running dirty covert operations to jihadist elements in Libya that were trying to overthrow the Gaddafi regime. And also to Syria. They set up an illicit arms pipeline to Syria to fuel arms through the Operation Timber Sycamore. So he wasn't exactly a Boy Scout. He was involved in all kinds of criminal arms smuggling operations. And he was targeted, as an enemy of the Libyan people. The media just twisted that and obscured what he was doing, and that there was a rational motive behind his assassination. And that's, the media we've seen in this era, just complete censorship and distortion of these conflicts. And that's why the American public wakes up now. It's too late. I mean, now Ukraine, now, we see it's a disaster, but for years, now more and more people are seeing that. And as you say, they're going to have to cut and run. And ultimately, Russia is the biggest winner. They acquired a huge portion of Ukraine's territory, and there's a lot of the mineral wealth in eastern Ukraine yet to be explored. So Russia is a huge victor. People are left scratching their head. Why did we invest hundreds of billions of dollars? I was at the Rage Against the War Machine rally. You were a speaker, and Jimmy Dore had a great speech. He had like a top 10 list of how we could have spent that. Then it was about 100 billion that had gone to Ukraine. And he's like, we could cure cancer, we could end the homeless population, bring the homeless back out and end it again, cure AIDS and all these things. And instead we wasted, it's like Afghanistan. But people wake up too late. They realize only in hindsight it's a disaster because the media coverage is so biased and because they censor any critical voice. The public, we need a revolution against the media. We need an open media system that will report these conflicts so that we don't recognize the disaster after the fact, that we see what's going on, we stop it, and we get rid of these criminal leaders who carry out these operations. They never face any consequences. I mean, it was reported that maybe over 1 million Ukrainians died because of these, not just stupid, but criminal leaders who engineered this conflict that resulted in the death of 1 million Ukrainians, who knows how many Russians. You can't even imagine the human cost, the lives that are ruined, these people who sit in offices far removed and use these people as pawns and destroy their lives. And this is just not right. At least some of us have tried to speak out like you, but we're attacked and we're treated horribly just for standing up for basic human decency. And more people have to rally to us, those of us in the media who are trying to get the truth out there and stand up for humanity.
Yeah. So let's talk about it. I recall when Tulsi Gabbard was running in 2020, and and then, like I said, do I have issues with Tulsi in some areas? Absolutely. When it comes to Gaza and stuff like that, fair enough. But I'm like this. If you say something good on this subject, I will address that. If you say something bad on that subject, I'll say you were wrong there. I'm not like in love with any particular politician. I don't hate any particular politician, right? This is about the facts on the ground. And I remember Tulsi talking about it, saying, look, we were wrong in Syria, and it was a dirty war in Syria, and they lied about weapons of mass destruction, and we backed ISIS and stuff like that. And back then, man, they ripped her apart. And they here's what kills me: they got on her. You met with Assad, and I'm like, and I remember thinking, well, I remember when Nancy Pelosi met with Assad. I remember when lots of people met with Assad, not just her. Your thoughts on back then versus now? And let's face it, I mean, I got to give her credit, the courage to stand up and say what she said back then, when the whole machine just came down on her like a ton of bricks.
Yeah, well, and up to 2 weeks ago, they were attacking her during the confirmation hearing, and this is why Democratic Party has lost so much support, and progressives like us are just totally disgusted. I mean, the way she was harangued, I watched this segment with this guy Michael Bennett from Colorado, who's on the Senate Intelligence Committee, and he was trying to get her to admit that Edward Snowden was a traitor, and he was attacking her, for meeting with Assad and others. I mean, they were attacking her last week, and the Washington Post had a very biased article about it, and repeating this idea that she's promoting conspiracy theories. But with regard to the chemical weapons attack, she was one of the few in the political establishment who questioned that narrative. And she actually she did her homework. She met with Theodore Postel, is an MIT scientist, and I interviewed him and did an article. And he's a brilliant scientist who served as a Pentagon weapons advisor. And when I interviewed him, he sent me all these articles, and he did this serious study with like 6 other leading scientists to try and assess the chemical weapon attack in Khan Sheikhoun in 2017. That was used as Assad was accused of this attack. It was used as a basis for U.S. airstrikes, and he did a scientific study using advanced computer modeling, and found that it came from a certain area if the attack took place, because he found that the site looked to be staged, and it caused a crater which wouldn't have been caused by that kind of chemical attack, and that there were dead animals placed there afterwards just to stage the scene, and that if any attack, there was some kind of missile attack, and he found it had to have come from rebel area. So, and this was done in a very objective, scientific way. And Gabbard, did the responsible thing and met with him because he carried out this study to try and understand the situation. Because we're not scientists. We're sitting here in North America. We don't know what happened. But, he's done a serious study. So she met with him, and she called for more investigation. And I think that was the responsible thing to do. And we know the pattern of false flag operation and manipulating public opinion in support of wars. So yeah, I agree with you. I mean, she deserves credit. I think she was doing what a responsible political figure should do. And she also met with Assad. It doesn't mean I think they were conflating an American leader meeting with an adversary to try and diffuse a conflict and engage in diplomacy, which is the job of the State Department and politicians. And she was doing that. And she was never apologizing or heroizing Assad. She was just carrying out her duties to try and diffuse that conflict and the horrible human costs. I mean, that was a conflict, again, the evidence would indicate, engineered by the United States, starting with the Obama administration, which heavily supported these jihadist rebels, and was not a peaceful uprising. It was a violent uprising from the outset, dominated by Islamic fundamentalists. There was a fissure in Syrian society between the Baathists. The Assad dynasty came in the 70s, and they were connected with the Baath Party, which is a secular nationalist party that promoted pan-Arabism, and they were always faced with opposition. In the early 80s, there was an uprising of the Muslim Brotherhood, a very violent uprising. Assad accused the CIA of helping to foment that uprising. So there are always these fissures, going back years in Syrian society, and the CIA, as they always do, and U.S. government sought to exploit that to overthrow the Assad government, who was a secular nationalist, who stood up to Israeli and was trying to end the Israeli occupation, the Golan Heights, and had intervened in Lebanon and assisted Lebanon in the face of Israeli aggression. So, they didn't like Assad. They wanted him gone. And they allied, as usual. The pattern is that the U.S. allies with Islamic fundamentalist groups. That's what they did in Libya. Gaddafi was a secular nationalist. Gaddafi was actually similar to Assad. He was more a nationalistic leader. He nationalized the oil. In Libya, he used the oil revenue to develop Libya's economy, promote good education, healthcare. Assad as well had roots in socialism and oversaw a more socialistic economy. There was some liberalization, but it was a state-run economy to a certain extent. And they also had very good public services, good education system, healthcare, until this imperial attack really destroyed the country. And now Syria has 90% poverty level, horrendous conditions in the country, just a breakdown of their public health system. And that's caused in part by the sanctions. The sanctions combined with the war destroyed their economy. And the sanction was part of the regime change operation to impoverish the people and turn them against Assad and drive them into these violent jihadists who've now taken over the country. And the U.S., Thomas Friedman of the New York Times was typical celebrating, and also Democracy Now! They're celebrating this revolution when it's the triumph of Al-Qaeda, these head choppers, and now they're carrying out pogroms against Alawites, who had supported Assad, a certain Shiite group, and ethnic cleansing operations, and they're destroying churches. And these are just vicious Islamic elements who the U.S. has allied with in Syria since the 80s. And I think the goal is just to carve up Syria. Syria under Assad had emerged beginning in the 70s when Hafez al-Assad took over as kind of a center of Arab nationalism and the pan-Arab movement. And he was taking over from Nasser after Nasser was died in the early 70s. Assad kind of became a key figurehead of the Arab unity movement and Arab nationalist movement. And that's what the U.S. and CIA, since the U.S. wants to control the oil of the Middle East and dominate the region with its proxy Israel, their goal is to undermine all Arab nationalists and pan-Arab movements. And that's why they went after Gaddafi and Assad. And they want to destroy, balkanize the country, make it weak, and that will enable U.S. Israel to expand their hegemony. But they don't care about the people in Syria. They're happy. They deliberately engineer it so the people would suffer through war and poverty, and that their country should be weakened and destroyed. So that's how imperialism operates, and the American public should be more attuned to that. Do we want our government ruining other countries just so we can exploit their oil? It's utterly unethical and immoral.
Yeah. And as soon as they say, "Oh, she met with Assad, he's an evil dictator," I'm like, "Yeah, I remember. Let's see, Assad, they got to be bombed. Libya, they're run by dictators, they got to be bombed. Serbia, they're run by dictators, they got to be bombed. We got to take everything and overthrow the government of Russia because their leader's a dictator." And I'm like, why is it that every time I see a so-called dictator leader, the people in the country never hate them? The people usually like them. And it's like us saying, well, gee, right now, 90% of the people in China approve of their government. 90%. Well, of course, their economy's going good, and but they don't have the rights that I guess they got censorship. Oh, America's against censorship. Got to stop that. Here's an example of the absurdity. Now, this is February 12th. This is right now. Look at this. Correct. Genuine threat. Backlash hits Tulsi Gabbard as Putin's girlfriend. This is how infantile these people are, right?
Yeah.
Experts and critics expressed alarm. I wonder who they are. You notice they always say experts and critics, but they don't tell who they are. And they expressed alarm. Oh my gosh, a war might stop, right? And they go along. She's a genuine threat to our national security, right? This is according to some schmuck, and they wrote it on Twitter. So, I mean, you got to report it because it was written on X. She's a Putin and Assad sympathizer. What does that mean? Right now, we're meeting with, and let me tell you something. If Vladimir Putin's willing to do us a deal on oil, or we can get a good deal with him now on titanium or some natural resources that we want, uranium, all of the TVs tomorrow, the headlines, hey, Putin turned over a new leaf and he's a good guy, and they'll tell us to love him, right? She's in charge not only of our natural secrets, but our entire intelligence infrastructure. They caved to Trump. National security analyst Maine Walt concluded that Russian president owns Trump. He owns him after reflecting on right. Today is a great day for Putin. The Lincoln Project. So that we know that John Bolton and those people don't like him. Putin's laughing. Tulsi Gabbard is known in Russia as Putin's girlfriend. Right? America's being weakened. The Lincoln Project. Today's a great day for Putin. He finally has an asset at the highest level. He's Putin's girlfriend. Now, you look at this stuff and you're like, no wonder these people lost. You know what I mean? No wonder they were driven from power. No wonder they're the people with 51 intelligence agents telling us some lie. I mean, the juvenile nature of just assertions. He's Putin's girlfriend. Putin's celebrating. They're doing shots of vodka in the Kremlin. All that. Your thoughts on that imbecilic garbage that we have to look at?
Yeah, I mean, that's not journalism. That's just garbage. So, and what about, Zelensky's lover? I mean, Zelensky is proven to be a far more autocratic leader than Putin. Zelensky banned 12 parties. I mean, the Communist Party is legal in Russia, but it's banned in Ukraine. And the head of the Socialist Party in Ukraine was murdered in Moscow by government hit squads, and they've been assassinating people and carrying out car bombings and bombing, terrorist acts, bombing cafes, targeting journalists, bloggers, political figures. So, I mean, if they want to be consistent, they can have an article about Zelensky's boyfriends in the U.S. Congress who fawn and salivate over this murderous dictator who canceled elections. So, I mean, yeah, and the level, I agree with you. It's just juvenile. It's not journalism, and it's disturbing. I mean, that shouldn't be publishable. There should be a standard. And Gabbard. I mean, it's. I mean, all she did was, she was against the war in Ukraine. I never heard her make any statements valorizing Vladimir Putin. And as you say, Putin is very popular in Russia. I mean, if you want to try and be objective and develop a good U.S. policy, you have to analyze why Putin has long staying power in Russian politics, and what about him do the Russian people like? What are some of his accomplishments for Russia? And if you develop an objective assessment, you develop a successful, diplomacy with him. I mean, and that's an important relationship. The U.S. and Russia are two nuclear armed powers. There's a lot of benefit the countries can derive from each other. I mean, Russia is rich in natural resources, got a booming economy. The U.S. has a lot of investments in Russia. I mean, they've driven more, Russia to trade, entirely with China and Iran because of the sanctions. But I mean, there is a lot of opportunity for U.S. businesses. So I think smart U.S. leadership would just try and assess Putin. And instead of, unfortunately, we have these greedy criminals running our government who their main goal is just to totally exploit Russian natural resources and steal it like they do in other countries, so that they can't deal with Putin because he's actually a leader for the Russian people who's not going to do, Boris Yeltsin was the perfect leader for that class of American greed who's run our country, because Yeltsin was basically a pawn of the West who was willing to sell out his own population. I mean, he was a drunken buffoon, Yeltsin, and he surrounded himself with these corrupt mafia type figures, and they pushed these privatization policies that was putting all of Russia's wealth in their own hands and opening it up for a complete exploitation by American and Western multinational corporations. And Putin put a stop to that. And that resulted in the worst Great Depression. The situation in Russia in the 90s, a lot of people aren't aware, is that it was worse than the Great Depression in the United States. And the actual the living age declined by 7 years. A country had never seen their the lifespan, average lifespan plummeted in just 7 years after the fall of communism. It plummeted like 7 years in a 7-year span. If you look at the Great Depression in the United States, it wasn't even the number wasn't even like that. So this is a catastrophe for the Russian people. So any reasonable Russian leader, just like, I mean, we had FDR come in a depression and enact a New Deal and enact some policies that got us out of the depression. If an American leader wasn't working to do that, he would never have lost it at all. He would have been overthrown. So it's the same in Russia. I mean, they have to have a leader who's working for their population. He's running their country. And the U.S. can't take that, but they should. I mean, and Putin was very pro-American when he first came in. In fact, he was the first leader to call George W. Bush after 9/11 to offer his sympathies. So this is a leader the U.S. could work with, and there are a lot of benefits if we have responsible leadership instead of just a gang of criminals intent on looting countries. And that gets to the heart of it, because Gabbard is a reasonable leader. Yeah, I mean, I'm on your page. I don't always agree with her, but she had done a lot of very sensible things, and she showed a certain maturity that other leaders haven't. And that's the benefit of the American popular. These policies aren't benefiting us. The war in Ukraine cost American taxpayers billions of dollars that should have been invested in the American economy. So this is not a beneficial policy. And actually, Putin, a lot of the U.S. businesses lost out, and that's why a lot of businessmen favor the Trump policy, which is now putting an end to the conflict, because the sanctions harm their business. They had a lot of business operations in Russia that were ruined because of the sanctions. So even the American, corporate elite was divided over that policy, and the public at large is not benefiting at all from the sanctions and war policy. And I think our public would benefit from having good relations with the Russians. There's many constructive avenues, and I think Gabbard is one of the few who sees that. And so it just reflects, their stupidity, that they attack her in this juvenile way. As you say, more and more people are waking up, and they're not supporting those kind of political candidates who use that rhetoric. And hopefully we can overcome what we've lived through as an era of new McCarthyism. And hopefully we're slowly coming out of that as these people get exposed for who they are, like Joseph McCarthy was. And they'll be on the wrong page of history. And hopefully students will learn in the coming years about how awful these people were, and that we should never go back there again in our history.
Well, and here's a perfect example. If you go to Africa, if you go to the Middle East, here's a perfect example. Here's an African, where are we? Here's a protest in Africa, and oh, wait a minute, that's not the one I wanted to show. If look here. So what do you see at the protest in Africa, right? You see Russian flags. You see the people there. I remember watching this African leader, and they were saying, well, what is it about Russia, blah, 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 the United States? And he was basically saying, well, look, the United States come there, they overthrow our government, they assassinate people. He said, the Russians treat us as equals. The Russians do business deals with us, right? So we demonize whatever it is, Russia or China, but you go to Africa, you go to South America, you go to the global South, where the people have a lot of natural resources, but they're exploited by the West. And these countries are like, we're friends with Russia. We're friends with China. They treat us well. You know what I mean? And so we are demonized, and then we demonize the leader of the African country, and the CIA goes in and overthrows him and puts in, whoever, Paul Kagame or some other. How the hell does Paul Kagame get worth $500 million in friggin' Kenya or something? You know what I mean? We know how that works. But anyway, but I think now, one thing I think about Tulsi Gabbard, for whatever weaknesses or strengths that she has, when you hear her talk about Ukraine, it's like, yeah, that's what I'd say. When you hear her talk about Syria, recently she said the guy in charge of Syria came from ISIS. The guy in charge of Syria came from ISIS. She says, look, she's been saying for years, we're funding ISIS. We're funding ISIS. So I do think the one thing I can say about Tulsi Gabbard is, as opposed to what we've been getting, which were these CIA cooked up USAID false flag narratives, I think at least maybe she'll tell Trump something, even if it's only one thing, something that's true. And whether we agree with Trump or don't like him about whatever, you're always better off making a decision based on the truth than you are on some cooked up narratives about the Russians fighting with shovels and running out of missiles and having to use washing machine chips to program their planes.
Yeah, well, and 2 points. Yeah, on Africa. Yeah, I spent about 6 months in Zambia. My ex-wife was from there, and I met a lot of people. In fact, the neighbor where I was staying, I talked to him at length. His son had studied in Russia, and he had all these Russian books, and some were in English, so I could read them. Like, it was interesting to see their perspective on all kinds of world conflicts. But he had very high regard for Russia. His son had studied there. I mean, a lot of Zambians studied in an African country. They studied in Russia. And as far as China, like China built the Zambian Railway. I mean, there were mixed attitude to China because China was involved in a lot of the mining projects, and they were seen to exploit the local labor force. On the other hand, they did invest a lot in the country in building a soccer stadium and infrastructure, and so it's more of a mixed record. There were very negative attitude toward Britain and the United States because, Britain just left the people impoverished. They refused to educate them. They were just there to exploit their resources. And the United States was just mistrusted, especially for the drone bases they were developing across Africa and all this militarization. And they're not really putting that much into the country. They have some development projects, but a lot of them are self-serving. So that was just my sense of popular attitudes in Zambia. And actually, when I was there, Gaddafi came, and he was treated as a hero. This was first time I went there was 2007. And that was an education for me to see how Gaddafi was demonized in Western media, but how he was beloved in Africa. And he was like viewed as a kind of king. And even Mugabe, there was some respect for him because of some of the things he had done, to reclaim the land from the whites and to take more local control over their economy. So, I mean, there were bad things people said about him too, but it's more of a objective assessment. I mean, than you get here, which is just pure demonization. So, and that's what we're saying. A lot of these leaders, if you go to those countries, and I was also in Russia, so I got to talk to people, their attitude, and they had criticism of Putin, but they also explained why a lot of people supported him and how their economy was so much better from the 1990s, and a critique they had of Yeltsin. So you can better understand the situation in those countries and then the bias of our media, and it's part of this agenda, nefarious agenda, to go in and exploit these countries for the benefit of our corporations. Hopefully more people will become aware as they've seen the terrible thing that have gone on in the last several years. And with regard to Gabbard, I think I forget, what was your question about her?
Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you about was this. Do you remember in Syria, and she mentioned them, and if you could update people, the white helmets, remember that propaganda outfit?
Yeah.
who, might I add, I think they were involved. So they were supposedly involved in staging some of the WMD false flags. What do you know about the white helmets?
Yeah, that seemed to have been it was exposed. The Gray Zone Project had some good articles exposing them as a kind of intelligence front where they presented this veneer of being this humanitarian organization, but they were staffed by Al Qaeda and they helped set up some of these false flags, like with the chemical weapons attacks, and they were at the forefront claiming they had people on the scene who witnessed this, but they never presented credible information. It was rather kind of dubious information. And yeah, so it seemed to be just like also promoting anti-Assad propaganda, and that's what you had a lot of with Syria, a lot of manipulation of public opinion, and there was a strong attacks against leftists. You know, the attacks against Gabbard was synonymous with the attacks against anybody who questioned these narratives was attacked as an Assad lover. And you had a lot of this on the left, like normally left-wing websites were running articles that usually were against U.S. wars, like Counterpunch, were running these pieces by people attacking those who were, calling out the lies on Syria and against U.S. involvement, calling them all kinds of names that Gabbard was called, Assad lovers and tankies, and then there was this whole thing about the Kurds that we need to support the Kurds and military intervention is legitimate to save the Kurds. But the Kurds were kind of being molded into a proxy force to fight alongside ISIS against the Assad government. And they had historical grievances, but I mean, against Assad perhaps, but the Kurds were always used. U.S. intelligence and the CIA always use minority groups and take advantage of those grievances to recruit them for their own purposes, and then they hang them out to dry. So, I mean, usually they suffer a much worse fate because then they're considered to be collaborators and vengeance is taken on them. So they don't ultimately benefit. And this compassion for the Kurds, it just came all of a sudden at a time when the U.S. was ratcheting up its involvement. Like, you don't hear about that now, about the Kurds, and you didn't hear any concern about them and their problem before. And then there were the left got enamored with this alleged Rojava anarchist experiment, but it was all a myth. Like, it was really just a very authoritarian run enclave within the Kurdish area, but they made like it was this experiment with these utopian leftist ideologies that had little to do with reality. And then you don't hear about that. So, I mean, I think that the CIA may have co-opted groups on the left and were pushing these kind of things and these attacks on principled anti-war and anti-imperialists. And that was tied with these attacks on Tulsi Gabbard. And I think that was driven by the intelligence agencies and the military industrial intelligence complex. So, it's a learning curve for those of us who are independent and want to oppose the warfare state. We shouldn't fall into these traps they try and set for us. And we need to build an independent anti-war movement that opposes, an anti-imperialist movement that opposes these kind of interventions and this kind of foreign policy, and that calls out these fake narratives. And I agree. I mean, Gabbard was on the right side of Syria, was a rare voice in a position of power. And the way they treated her, it was shameful. I mean, I was just appalled watching the 2020 debates when she got on the stage and actually said some sensible things. And then they attacked her mercilessly, Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton. And to me, they were just repeating what Joseph McCarthy said in his day. I was just disgusted with them. And that's when she left the Democratic Party.
Well, let me ask you this, because one of the things we're talking about false flags, right? And over the history of and I know you as a person, an expert, I consider a person who studied the history of various false flags. If you could, I know there's been false flags in history that were pretty well documented, right? Like Operation Northwoods and things like that. If you could like, just tell us about a couple of these false flags that maybe people don't know about, that people would find shocking, or even potential or proposed false flags that would be perpetrated on the American people, intelligence operations.
Sure, yeah, and I plan on writing a book on this topic that looks at false flags in American history, going back over 100 years and up through the present day. And these are very frequent because I think in a democracy, the governing elite wants to have public support for wars and wants to have this illusion that the wars are carried out defensively. They can't just say, we're going in there. Well, Trump said it, and that's why he's, some in the ruling class, I think, don't like him. He said we're there to steal their oil, but usually leaders don't talk in that way. They frame it as a defensive action. I think the best known is the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where, and that's what led to the U.S. escalation in Vietnam. And that was a clear false flag. And we have the documentation that's come out about that now. And it was first leaked through the Pentagon Papers. And that was, it was presented to the public that 2 U.S. ships were attacked on the South China Sea by North Vietnam. And so the U.S. had to go to war for defensive purposes. Of course, you could ask, why were 2 U.S. ships in the naval ships in the South China Sea in the first place? But then, it came out that they were actually on an operation. There was an operation called O-Plan where they shelled the North Vietnamese islands, and that it was designed to engender a counterattack that could be presented as an offensive attack by the North Vietnamese, when really it had been set up, and the aggressor was the 2 ships carried out the first attacks on North Vietnam. Another well-known case in history that's well documented is the Lusitania incident that led to the U.S. escalation in World War I. In that case, it was a luxury liner that was traveling to Europe with about 100 American passengers, including businessmen and tourists, and some member of the Vanderbilt family. And the ship was allegedly attacked by Germany and destroyed. But it came out later, there was a British commission that uncovered, and later investigation, that there were explosives planted on the ship, and that it was deliberately blown up. But the plan was to blame Germany. And that was actually largely a British operation because they wanted to get the United States into the war. They were losing the war. And Winston Churchill was a key figure in that plot. He was the head of the British Navy, and he deliberately withheld rescue boats so more people would die because they wanted to maximize public outrage. But there was collaboration between the British and Woodrow Wilson in this false flag operation was designed to mobilize public outrage against Germany and get the public. So similar to the chemical weapon attack, I think that's a classic false flag with the same goal of Lusitania, to mobilize hatred, public hatred against Assad, like Germany in World War I, and build momentum to support military operations. In that case, Trump, bombed. The U.S. had the largest covert operation since the Afghan war to arm the jihadist rebels. And then Trump, bombed Syria, and the Israelis bombed it many times. So, I think, and then you could look at the Libyan conflict and all the disinformation they spread about Gaddafi, that he was providing his soldiers Viagra to carry out rapes. That was part of a false flag. And they were accusing him of genocide, when actually in Benghazi, it was a violent fundamentalist uprising. They accused him of genocide, but it was the CIA and Western countries were supporting a violent fundamentalist uprising in Benghazi. And ethnic cleansing was carried out by the rebel. When they took power, they carried out ethnic cleansing of black population in Libya, like Tawarga, who were supporting Gaddafi, and they were pogromed against black people, because a lot of the blacks in Libya supported Gaddafi, and that was not really reported in our media. And all these liberals, supposedly concerned about this anti-racism education, but where were they when black people subjected to genocide and ethnic cleansing? They said nothing because Obama was the president then. So,
Well,
but
you,
I think
oh,
Libya was a false flag with Syria, and it fits the pattern going back to World War One. So that's what I want to show in this book. I'd like to write how it goes back a long way in history, and it carries over through the present day.
one of the things I saw that happened, there was a false flag in Ukraine where they wanted to take out the Russian Orthodox Church. And I even saw the video. So what they did was they sent this all by himself, this like Ukrainian military guy in fatigues and all. So he goes into a Ukrainian Russian Orthodox church and starts knocking things down and causing all these problems and pushing people, right? And so then the people in the church had to like restrain him and like pull him and drag him out of the church. Well, what they did was they didn't film him knocking things down and knocking Bibles down. They didn't film that. When the people in the church started kind of restraining him and grabbing him and dragging him out of the church, they filmed all that. And then they showed it on Ukrainian TV and they said, look at this, the Russian Orthodox, they're beating up our loyal and patriotic soldiers. We've got to shut down these Ukrainian Orthodox churches. And that's when they started in in Ukraine, the pogroms against the Russian Orthodox Church. And it was like, and basically there are people now that are saying that came from the White House. That basically in Washington, they saw the Russian Orthodox Church, centuries long ties, of course, to Russia. They saw that as a threat. They saw that as still having cultural ties to Russia, and they wanted that cut off. So that basically Washington actually authorized and pushed persecution of Christians, of Russian Orthodox Christians. And then, of course, they set up the false flag gets set up. They show it on, and then they showed like it was on Ukrainian TV all over the place. Look at these Russian Orthodox Christians beating up, and they like dragged out, monks and preachers and stuff, or whatever you call them, from the Russian Orthodoxy, and arrested them, put some on house arrest, beat them, mistreated the parishioners, everything.
Wow, yeah, there have been a lot of, I believe, such incidents in the Ukraine conflict. And one, I was studying the 1990s Balkan conflict. There was a lot of false flags in that conflict too. Like they staged a bombing to blame it on the Serbs in Sarajevo, and it was actually the Muslims who carried it out. And they were kind of desperate. They wanted foreign intervention, so they were staging these kinds of attacks. And that seems to be the modus operandi of the U.S. warfare state. This went back in the Phoenix Project. If you study that in Vietnam, they would dress up people as Viet Cong soldiers, but they're really ARVN, the U.S. ally. Yeah, that's a great book by Doug Valentine. And they would dress them up as Viet Cong, commit atrocities, and make people think it was the Viet Cong. And that was the way to build hatred against the Viet Cong and fuel these kind of narratives of good versus evil. So they do that repeatedly in every conflict, and people should be attuned to that. But it's hard to know when the conflict's going on. Yeah, in some cases they are kind of crude and they look amateurish. But in other cases, and even these chemical weapons attack are pretty amateurish. They were like putting these dead animals. How did the animal get there? And
Right,
like
exactly. A deer was wandering around in the middle of the city.
yeah, exactly. So it is kind of amateurish in a lot of cases. Some of them are professionally coordinated, but people are they're naive. A lot of people don't know the history. They haven't read the Valentine book. They don't know how the U.S. government has done this for years, and they're caught up in the moment, and they watch this stuff, and and they maybe don't think a lot about it. They're just kind of flipping the news and they see this and it impresses them. Oh, Assad, he's an animal. He did this, So it just, they play on people's emotion and sadly it works.
Let me ask you this. I don't know if it was Operation Northwoods, but apparently there was one back then where they wanted to take American planes and paint them as Russian planes and bomb Americans and American bases, and they wanted to do attacks in Miami and blame it on the Cuban. Are you familiar with what I'm talking about? And I think they presented it to JFK and he said no.
Yeah, well, yeah, Northwoods. That's one that was somehow came to light where they were planning all these things. Yeah, all kinds of attacks to blame on Castro because they wanted a full-fledged U.S. military invasion of Cuba. And that may have been, why the CIA and certain elements of the military, the hard right. Because, I mean, Kennedy, I've detailed in some articles I've written that he was not really a pacifist or a dove, but, I mean, the far right, he had some common sense, and that, he was not going to order a full-fledged military attack on Cuba. So that's why the intelligence agencies initiated Northwoods, to try and engender that outcome. And yeah, I mean, presidents can easily be manipulated, and that's one reason it's so difficult. Whatever intention of a president coming into office, he's often kind of at the whim of these intelligence services, and he's backed into corners by them. Because, I mean, they were the one with regard to Syria. They were promoting a lot of the disinformation about Syria. I don't know if Trump was particularly gung-ho. I mean, Trump is no dove either, but I don't know if he was particularly gung-ho about bombing Syria. But after the media played up these, after this false flag Psywar operation involving Assad and chemical weapons, he's kind of put in a position where he has to respond. He wants to look like he's in command and he's tough, and he's not going to allow this. So they kind of pushed the presidents into action. And I was doing an article, will be published in maybe a month or two, about the Skripal case, the poisoning, and that was a clear false flag. Like, they claim that Russians came in and put some sarin gas on his doorknob. And this was allegedly a
Novichok. It was the infamous Novichok.
Yeah, a Russian defector to the British MI6. But then the daughter actually admitted somebody came in and sprayed them at a restaurant, and that it wasn't a Russian. And if it was sarin, they would have died immediately. There was some kind of chemical they sprayed. It was all a false flag operation. But Gina Haspel was involved with British intelligence in pushing this narrative that the Russians had tried to poison them with Novichok. And that was designed to, after that, Trump kind of had to respond and escalated sanctions and weapon supplies to Ukraine. So those are just examples of how the intelligence agencies manipulate things and kind of push a president to adopt a more hardline policy, whatever his intention might have been coming into office. And then Kennedy.
And that was how crude was that, because this storyline didn't even make sense. You're going to tell me that they rubbed a poison on a doorknob that's like one of the most deadly poisons in the world, and if it touches you or comes anywhere near you, it will kill like everybody around in like 30 seconds. But for some reason, they touched the poison that kills you in 30 seconds. They then went and had pizza, hung out in a pizza shop after being exposed to a poison that will kill you in like a minute. Yeah. They then had pizza. After the pizza shop, they went and walked in the park. They sat down, and then both of them simultaneously, exactly 4.5 hours after touching a poison that will kill you in seconds, they simultaneously started frothing in the mouth and passed out. And by the way, they both then decided that they never wanted to see anybody on Earth again, and they disappeared. And I suspect they're both dead. The other thing is this.
Yeah.
And then the Russians, if Novichok there isn't good enough, then this other clown who was clearly an operative, I forgot his name, he's in Russia, and he gets sick, and he goes to what was his name? Navalny. Navalny gets sick. And he goes to the hospital. Go ahead, tell that story.
You tell.
Yeah, he goes to the hospital, and he's in the hospital in Russia for a while, and he's getting better. And he says, "I want to go to Germany." All right, they send him off to Germany. The Germans say Novichok poisoning, and then they say he was poisoned. The Russians tried to kill him. They gave him Novichok poisoning in the airport, and the Russians say, "Great, we got a video of the airport, so we can look at what happened." And he said, "Come to think of it, it wasn't the airport. That it was bottles of water, and somebody was able to sneak the bottles of water out of Russia with Novichok in them, and it didn't kill them or anybody else for some reason. And we've got the bottles of water in the UK, and the Russians to say, okay, well, let's see the bottles of water. Now, come to think of it, it wasn't that." somebody smeared Novichok on the lining of his underwear. So every time the Russians would say, okay, well, let's go with this story, they would change the story. So he was smeared with Novichok 3 different ways that will kill you instantly. But for some reason, he survived for days in a Russian hospital. And only when he went to Germany did they figure out that it was Novichok. Here's what we learned. The most poisonous substance known to man never seems to kill anybody. And if the Russians want somebody dead, for some reason, if the Russians want you dead, they're the worst assassins in the world. They're unsuccessful every time. Your thoughts?
Yeah, and they make themselves look horrible, and they give the West a reason to, justify going after them. And in the Skripal case, they claim that somehow this poison got into a perfume bottle that this woman ingested named Dawn Sturgis, who died. But then it came out that she died of a drug overdose. Like the autopsies found she died of a drug overdose, and that like her and her boyfriend were involved in the drug scene. And like a guy admitted he had given them bad drugs. And the whole thing kind of fell apart. And then there was this cop who allegedly went to the house and he got poisoning, but only like very mildly, and he recovered after a day.
And same with the Skripals. Remember, there was an officer there that supposedly they got poisoned from Skripal. Somebody. So we've got about 5 people. Who were subjected to the most poisonous substance that nobody survives, that would kill everybody, and for some reason nobody ever dies of it.
Yeah, and it just happened to be, the person who discovered them was like very high level military officer in the British military, just happened to be walking by and sees them. And yeah, they can't be alive, because in this article I was going into that case, and I was reading this book by John Helmer that's just been published. He's an Australian journalist who works in Moscow and does independent reporting. And he said that Skripal's mother died, and he was very close to his mother. And like he didn't attend the funeral, he didn't make a phone call, send flowers. So that gives indication that he'd been dead for a long time, because he would have been there for his mother. So it showed these are deadly operations. People get killed, and they sustain these lies, and eventually the lies break down. But at the time, it's hard to question. Anybody who questions that, they are attacked immediately as Putin lovers or supporters of these allegedly. They want to link you with these assassins or something. So they're masters at the game in a way, but it's really deadly. There's a great book years ago written about the CIA by a CIA operative named Ralph McGahey called Deadly Deceits: My Life in the CIA. And that's, I think, a very good title. It's deceits, and we could laugh about it, but it's deadly. People get killed, people get silenced, and it leads to war. These are the kind of incidents that lead to wars that kill thousands upon thousands of people, and that poison the world environment. So the consequences are horrendous, and that's why we need a movement to rein in these rogue agencies. They have a cataclysmic effect for society, and it's just pure evil what they do.
Yeah. The other thing I remember about Skripal is we found that there were Russian agents who flew in using their own passports and went to a hotel and partied with like strippers and all of this, like, because you wouldn't want to bring attention to yourself if you were a Russian assassin, right? By partying in a hotel they'd have been in safe houses. So the whole story was so preposterous with them that it was like, we're really supposed to believe this story. And when they first came out with the story, they had the pictures of these guys, and they said they landed at Heathrow Airport at 9:30 a.m. But they were so good that they actually put the poison on the doorknob a half hour before they landed at Heathrow Airport. So that, of course, that story fell apart. It's always the same. It's so amateurish. So you know what? With all of this business about USAID, somebody should say to the Trump administration, would you look into what happened to the Scripples? Could somebody tell us, could you ask somebody? I want to talk to the Scripples and I want to talk to Joseph Mifsud. Those are the two people I want to talk to, the Scripples and Joseph Mifsud. I have a feeling they're in the same place. They're no longer on this mortal plane, shall we say. At any rate, thanks a lot. I got to get running, got a bunch of other stuff going on. But thank you very much. I'm going to get running. Don't forget, everybody, CovertActionMagazine.com. That's where you go for all of Jeremy's good work. Share this on all your social media platforms. I got another here at 11. There's a peace event going on that I'm going to stream for the people that are that have that going on also. So thanks a lot. And of course, as you know, follow me on Rockfin. Follow me on Telegram. Follow me on Rumble. You know, just in case, you never know, if they throw me off here, then at least you'll know where to find me, and I'll continue the good work. Thanks a lot, Jeremy, and look forward to talking to you again next week. I'm sure there's lots going on. We'll probably have another false flag by then.
Yeah, absolutely. They happen all the time.
All right, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, everybody. And by the way, if you can afford to contribute to the channel, whether it's buy me a coffee or Patreon or whatever, it's highly appreciated. Have a great day. We're out.